morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Harriet Hamasi, University Librarian at Brown, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Tara Nummedal, who will be our speaker this morning. We hope that others will kind of come in during the course of this morning. I've heard that maybe campus dance wiped people out last night. I don't know. Tara is the Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the History Department here at Brown. She received her PhD at Stanford in 2001 and came directly to Brown after that. So that's terrific. And Tara is not only an outstanding professor, she teaches courses on modern European history and history of science, but she's also a very active researcher. And of course, today we're going to hear about some of her research as well as the teaching that she probably does on this very area. Tara's first book was published in 2007 by University of Chicago Press, entitled Alchemy and Authority in the Holy Roman Empire. She's currently completing her second book, The Lion's Blood, Alchemy, Gender, and Apocalypse in Reformation Germany. And Tara will be on leave this next year, and in the fall she'll work on completing this book, and then in the spring she'll be working on the research that she's talking about today. Tara's scholarship has been supported by several very renowned institutes, and one, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Chemical Heritage Foundation, and most recently, the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. As I mentioned, Tara is working on a project in part with the library to create a digital publication. And it won't be just like a PDF, a kind of online visual page image, but it will be something quite different. And Tara was one of two faculty members that the university selected to work on this kind of digital publication initiative that was recently funded at Brown by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So we're very interested to hear about the progress that Tara is making and will make. But I just want to say a couple of words about Tara. In case you're wondering, does she have actually a normal life outside of this university? And she does. Tara is a wife. Her husband is also a faculty member at Brown, and they have a darling child. And I remember when Tara was about to have that child. And it's a fabulous thing to know that our faculty also are real people, and because they interact so closely with students who are learning how to be not only scholars, but productive people in their lives. So please join me in welcoming Tara. We look forward to your conversation.
Thank you, Harriet, for that lovely introduction. I'm really delighted to share some of the work that I've been doing this morning with you in this project we've been calling Project Atalanta. And I want to emphasize that we're just kind of getting going. So in some ways, in many ways, this is very much a work in progress. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to sort of try some things out with you today. I'm fairly new to what we call digital humanities now, what we're more and more calling digital humanities. I usually spend my time in archives in castles in Germany reading things like this, which are very decidedly not digital. Occasionally I use some printed sources as well, but last year I got involved with a project on a particular 17th century German book, Michael Maier's Atalanta fugiens, which you can see here. And I really came to the conclusion that this is the kind of book that lends itself to a digital environment in ways that I had not so far been struck with some of my other kinds of sources. It's an emblem book. It uses a combination of music, images, and text to explore one of the central goals of alchemy, and that is the production of the Philosopher's Stone. It's a complicated book. It hovers between aesthetic object, it's a beautiful book, allegory and laboratory manual. It's a multimedia object, as I hope to show you today, and it weaves together a number of strands from Renaissance culture, including classical myth, alchemical theory and practice, late Renaissance polyphony, and the fashionable Renaissance genre of the emblem book. I've always known about this book, and I've taken my students to see the copy that we're fortunate to have here at the Hay next door. But I've never really had the opportunity to think deeply and seriously about the book, in part because it's a bit overwhelming for a single scholar to get her mind around, as I think you'll see here today. And so from the outset, those of us coming together around this Project Atalanta knew that this had to be a collaborative project. It would take a group of us to kind of tackle this book. And I want to take a moment to mention my collaborator and co-director of this project, Donna Bielak, who's a historian and a postdoc at Columbia University, as well as the kind of larger interdisciplinary and international team of scholars who are working with us on this project. The other thing about Project Atalanta is that it offers this opportunity for us to think about how digital tools can open up new possibilities for teaching, but also for publishing our work and for sharing our work with different kinds of audiences. This project really forced me to rethink my own habits as a historian, but I really think that what we're aiming for with this project, a digital edition of this book, which will also incorporate new scholarship about the book, is really innovative and exciting. So I want to introduce you to the book, to Atalanta fugiens, and I hope to convince you today that it's an interesting and beautiful book in its own right, and assure you that for specialists in the field of history of alchemy, early modern books of music, it's a really important book as well. But again, I think it also offers an opportunity to think about some of the larger issues that are at the heart of what we do here at Brown. And that is, we can use Atalanta fugiens to think about books as a kind of technology, both for communicating information and actually creating new knowledge, a kind of tool for creating new knowledge as well. And maybe paradoxically, I think that digital tools, which sometimes are discussed as somehow antithetical to books, I think that these digital tools can actually help us better understand the book, the paper book, the book sitting next door in the hay, and really appreciate what it is that books do. So let's start here with the frontispiece of the book as a way to get into it. And we can start, whoops. Sorry, this is, okay. We'll start with the title page there on the left. The title, Atalanta fugiens, or The Fleeing Atalanta, New Chemical Emblems Regarding the Secrets of Nature by Michael Maier, whom you can see on the right, and more about him in a moment. Atalanta fugiens was probably published early in 1618. There are a couple of earlier editions floating around, but most of the copies, including the one we have next door, are from 1618. It's not a large book. It's about this big. You'll see more in a moment. It's a quarto book, 214 pages. It was printed in Oppenheim, sort of near Frankfurt in central Germany, by a really famous publishing house in the 17th century, the publishing house of Theodore de Brie, which was really the kind of premier publisher of illustrated books and maps and geographical books in the 17th century. The engravings in the book were probably executed under the direction of the author by Matthias Marian the Elder, who was the son-in-law of the publisher, Theodore de Brie. But Marian was also a renowned engraver in his own right. And some of you might be familiar with Marian's daughter, Maria Sibylla Marian, who was a well-known naturalist in the 18th century, who published some books about insects of Suriname, which we have both in the Hay and in the John Carter Brown Library across the green. So the point of this is to say that this is a really high quality kind of fancy book for the 17th century. One of my colleagues called this a kind of virtuoso performance of print and what print can do in the 17th century. So as we go through it, look at all the different fonts and the engravings and all of the kinds of modes of printing that went into it. On the right here we have the author, Michael Maier, who lived from 1568 to 1622. And his author's portrait here, which is inserted in some copies of the book, not all of them, but tells us that he held 3 titles, Imperial Count, Philosopher, and Doctor of Medicine. And he was indeed a university-trained medical doctor, and he was the personal physician to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II in Prague for a few years, until Rudolph was deposed by his brother Matthias, and Maier left Prague and traveled around Germany and the Low Countries and eventually to England. Maier was a very prolific author. He wrote over 20 books, mostly on alchemy, hieroglyphics, and Hermetic philosophy. He was also fascinated by a set of treatises that appeared right around the same time as Atalanta fugiens, announcing the existence of a Rosicrucian brotherhood. And Maier desperately wanted to be a part of this Rosicrucian brotherhood, and so he responded to these treatises in print as well, and kind of basically said, I want to be part of this reform project that the Rosicrucians involved in. And so he's often described as a Rosicrucian as well. Atalanta fugiens is Maier's best known work, and again, we're very fortunate to have a copy at the Hay next door. So you can see on the title, and I've already mentioned that this is an emblem book, and so I want to say a word about the genre of the emblem book first. This was a new genre that appeared in the 16th century and basically became incredibly fashionable in learned circles. The first printed emblem book was this one, Emblematum Liber, published in 1531, and it was written by an Italian named Andrea Alciato. And it was a series of short Latin verse texts. You might sort of think of them almost as proverbs, and accompanying woodcuts to go with them. Alciato's emblem book was a huge success. It went through many, many, many editions, translated into many languages, and essentially created this new genre, which became, as I mentioned, really fashionable. And you have to think of it as a kind of a game for erudite gentlemen and occasionally women as well. These emblems were meant to spark discussion. They were kind of an opportunity for people to show off their erudition and their knowledge of classical myths and, of course, their Latin and so on. An emblem always had three parts, as you can see here. There was always a motto on the top, and the motto here is a woman's reputation, not her beauty, should be known to the world. There was always an image, in this case the woodcut, and then there was always an epigram down below. And this one says, kindly Venus, what form is this? What does that tortoise mean, on which, O goddess, your soft feet rest? Phidias fashioned me like this. He intended the female sex to be represented by this image of me. Girls should stay at home and keep silence, and so he put such symbols under my feet. So you can imagine sort of reading this and then talking about it and debating the message therein and so on. Now, Maier, this is an image of the copy at the Hay next door, and Atalanta fugiens, we're back to Atalanta fugiens now, and this too is, of course, an emblem book, but it's a much more elaborate and a later example of this genre, as I think you'll see in a moment. After some prefatory material, we have a dedication there. It follows the same basic outline of an emblem book in the sense that there's a motto on the top, an epigram, the emblem, the image, and then the epigram down on the bottom, which you see on the right. But Maier adds a few details that makes it a bit more complicated. He adds music on the left for three voices. This emblem book is also bilingual. There is Latin on the right, there's German in the left, translations of each other, the German a translation of the Latin. And then after each emblem, he adds a 2-page Latin discourse that supposedly clarifies the meaning of the emblem. Often it just makes it more complicated, but and so the Atalanta fugiens consists of 50 of these sets, right? With each set having the music, the image, the motto, and the epigram in Latin, in German, and then the 2-page discourse following this. Unlike Alciato's emblem book, though, the emblems in Atalanta fugiens are not sort of separate individual emblems, but they all form interlocking pieces of a puzzle with the various parts of each emblem working together, and then all 50 emblems in the book as a whole working together to express Michael Maier's visions of what alchemy should be. Now, if we go back to the frontispiece, this is our guide to what Maier is doing with this book. He tells us quite explicitly on the front and in the following epigram what he's doing. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. So if we begin with the title here, Atalanta fugiens, that is the new chemical emblems of the secrets of nature. And below the title, the text declares that the work contains 50 emblems to engage the eyes and the intellect, accompanied by 50 musical fugues for 3 voices to engage the ears and the soul, all of which, he says, are to be contemplated, sung, and listened to with great pleasure. Now, the title of the book is Atalanta fugiens. So who is Atalanta? And I hope some of you in the back can see this. We have Atalanta down on the bottom. And this is a reference to the classical myth of Atalanta, featured more recently in Free to Be You and Me, if you are of that generation, which that's the version I grew up with. But in Ovid's version, she is a fleet-footed virgin whose hand in marriage could only be won by a man who could beat her in a foot race. And of course, any man who lost the race would pay for his audacity with his life. So this was a bold move to try to race Atalanta. And many men failed and indeed lost their lives until Hippomenes came along. And he too wanted Atalanta's hand in marriage. And conveniently, he earned the help of Venus, the goddess of love, who decided to help him by giving him 3 golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. And Venus told Hippomenes to simply toss these apples during the race in front of Atalanta. She would be so, beguiled by these lovely objects that she would stoop down to pick them up, and it would slow her down, and ultimately he would win the race. Not to mention she'd be carrying 3 heavy golden apples, I suppose. That would slow her down as well. And you can see down on the bottom here, they're racing, and Atalanta is stopping to pick down the apple, and Hippomenes still has 2 more, but he's getting ahead because she has stopped there. Eventually, Hippomenes prevails, and he wins the race, and thus Atalanta's hand. But unfortunately, the couple neglected to give proper thanks to Venus. Uh-oh, yes. Venus, of course, was enraged, and so she caused the couple to be so overcome with lust that as they passed by the temple of Cybele here, they decided to consummate their love in her temple, which the great mother goddess of Cybele, this of course enrages her, which is also a bad idea. And she takes out her revenge by turning Atalanta and Hippomenes into 2 lions who are condemned to pull Cybele's chariot in eternal servitude. Okay, so this is the story of the frontispiece, and some of the details around the top left are images from the Garden of the Hesperides, but we'll leave those alone for the moment. Okay, so what does this all mean, and what does this have to do with alchemy and music and all of these emblems inside the book? Fortunately, early modern European books are often very explicit, and he tells us even more when you turn the page and look at the author's epigram. Hippomenes, he tells us, represents sulfur, and Atalanta represents fleeing mercury, which is liquidy, right, and always sort of fleeing away. And Maier also says that, quote, in the race, the woman is conquered by the sea, or salt, meaning that the third kind of participant in the race, the apple, represents salt. So we have sulfur, mercury, and salt. And this is a reference to the idea of the tria prima, the 3 kind of principles or the 3 elements of matter that many 17th century alchemists, and particularly followers of Paracelsus, thought comprised all matter, including metals and minerals. So sulfur represented the hot, dry, combustible element in matter. Mercury represented the cold, wet, and kind of fluid and changeable element of matter. And salt represented the solid and permanent and sort of fixed element in matter. Okay, so we have the 3 main characters in the story, and together they represent the 3 aspects of any kind of matter, including metals. Now, alchemists believed that in order to make the philosopher's stone, the alchemist had to find a way to join together sulfur and mercury, these 2 opposite parts of matter, one cold and wet and the other hot and dry. And one idea in the 17th century was that you could join sulfur and mercury and fix them together using salt. And so this begins to make a bit of sense. The union of Atalanta, or Mercury, who keeps running away or fleeing, and Hippomenes, who slows her down and ultimately fixes her with the help of the golden apples, is significant. This is connected in some way to the production of the Philosopher's Stone. But why the music? Again, Maier tells us, or I'll go back here for a moment, Maier tells us in the epigram, my muse gives you 3-part fugues in order to render this race in pictures of equal nature. One voice remains simple and delaying and represents the apple, but the other voice is fleeing, and the third follows in the right way. And he continues, let these emblems manifest themselves to your ears and to your eyes. But after that, let your reason examine the secret meaning of them. I've brought these things to the attention of your senses, that your mind may grasp from these decoys what treasures lie hidden in them. In short, the music and the images, the sort of pretty aspects of the book are meant to lure you in, right? To attract your ears and eyes and lure you in so that your mind can dig deeper into the deeper treasures that lie hidden in this book. And Maier concludes his epigram with a hint about what those treasures might be. What the world has in wealth, what medicine has in benefit, all this the twofold lion can provide. So now we know that the true secret of the book is those lions representing Atalanta and Hippomenes after they have been transformed by their union with the apple, and that these lions can provide health and wealth. In other words, the lions represent the Philosopher's Stone, which alchemists believed could be used to both transmute metals into gold or sometimes silver, and to create the alchemical elixir, which could confer health and longevity as well. So this classical myth, the music and the images are ultimately about the creation of the Philosopher's Stone, and the chemical process at work is the transformation of mercury and sulfur, Atalanta and Hippomenes, into the lions representing the Philosopher's Stone. Completely clear, right? So how is this book supposed to help you get there? So let's dive into one particular emblem so you can get a sense of how this book was intended to work. And I'd like to use this emblem, which at the moment is my favorite of them, as an example. Let's start with the motto on the top. We'll look at the side with the image and we'll take the Latin. It's the same in the German. But the motto at the top is, make Latona white and rip up the books. Heresy in the library, I know. But and we see underneath the emblem, our eye moves down to, underneath the motto, our eye moves down to the emblem, and we see it translated into an image. We see Latona in the center, the Greek goddess Latona, who is the mother of Apollo and Diana, the twins. She's sitting in the center, and she's being washed on the left by another classical figure who has some water and is cleansing her. And then on the right, another sort of classical with a Renaissance hat kind of figure is ripping up some books. And you can see a big pile of ripped up books on the ground on the right. And the image has two halves, much like the motto has two halves. So make Latona white on the left and rip up the books on the left, divided kind of right down the middle there. If we then move down to the epigram, we get even more detail about this. And the epigram addresses these two children. And you'll see that one of them on the left has the head of a sun, and the other has a crescent moon sitting on her head. And the epigram says, everyone knows the twin offspring of Latona, who were sired by Jove, as the old story goes. Some say that this offspring is the light of the sun mixed with the moon, whose face has black spots. Therefore, see to it that you whiten Latona, condemn and rip up the books which are giving ambiguity, and let there not be delay. Now, Maier is presuming here a learned reader, which is reasonable since so much of this book is in Latin, who would understand these classical references and immediately recognize that that's Latona and the parents of Apollo and Diana. Okay, now let's look at the music on the left. Again, the author's epigram said, my muse gives you three-part fugues. One voice remains simple and delaying and represents the apple. So let's start with the voice of the apple here. This is music for three parts. The apple melody is always at the bottom there. And the melody that the apple part sings is exactly the same in each of the 50 fugues. It doesn't change, unlike the melodies on top of it by the other two voices, which vary from emblem to emblem. In musical terms, the apple's part is known as a cantus firmus, a steady melody, a kind of unchanging foundation to the kind of variation that's laid on top of it. This particular apple's melody is not something that Maier himself made up. He was not a musician or a composer, but was actually lifted from the Kyriale, which was a collection of Gregorian chant settings for the Latin Mass, and specifically from one of the central melodies, the Cuncta Potens Genitor Deus. So this music is actually quite medieval. It would have been very sort of old-fashioned by the 17th century. And it's associated with the Mass. And so it's a sort of hint from Maier at the sort of oldness of alchemy, its medieval moment, and also the sacred quality of the alchemical work. Maier also told us the other voice is fleeing and the third follows in the right way. So we have two other voices as well. And these fugues are actually canons. So think row, row, row your boat, right? One person starts and the next voice follows. So one voice leads and the second follows. And there's a bit of a pun in here for Maier. The Latin fugere means to flee, as in Atalanta fugiens, Atalanta fleeing. So in calling them fugues, he's playing around again with the title of the book and all of this fleeing. And in this case, one voice is fleeing and the other voice is following. The lead voice, the first voice to sing, switches off throughout the book between Atalanta and Hippomenes, depending on who is ahead in the race at any one moment, right? Sometimes Atalanta was out in front, other times Hippomenes was out front. And the melodies for these two voices, Atalanta and Hippomenes, change from emblem to emblem. The melodies are different, but they're always on top of this unchanging apple part. And finally, the words in each fugue come from the Latin epigram that is associated with it. So let's listen to the music, which you'll see here performed by a solo voice ensemble, Les Canards Chantantes, the Singing Ducks, who are one of our collaborators in this project. And I'm going to show you a clip from a performance that they give, a performance lecture that they did here at Brown in February, along with my collaborator, Donna Billock, and a couple of other people, in the Anne Mary Brown Memorial over on Brown Street this past February. So you'll see the setting in the background. I don't know how many of you have been in there, but you might recognize it. The part of the apple is sung by the bass, Graham Beer, in the center, with the alto Robin Beer in the lead as Atalanta, and the soprano Molly Netter following as Hippomenes. And so for those of you keeping track, Atalanta is still out in front at this point in the race here. And I've put the Latin in case you want to follow along with the music. Okay. So let's return to this emblem now that we've kind of looked at all the different parts and see if we can kind of start to put them together and dig a little deeper into the alchemical meaning, which is ultimately what Maier intended us to do, right? Get beyond the flashy images and the music and get into the alchemical meaning. What I like about this particular emblem is that it gets to the heart of what I think Atalanta fugiens is really about, which is about the relationship between two different parts of alchemy. Its bookish side, that is reading books, reading texts, putting them in conversation with other arguments and other bits of information and trying to work out what all these different authors are saying. And on the other hand, the laboratory side of alchemy, which is alchemists were meant to do things and make things. So let me pause for a moment and say a bit about what alchemy was in 1618 when Maier published this book. When he published this book, alchemy was in what one historian has called its golden age. By Maier's lifetime, alchemists had been writing and reading and practicing their art for over a millennium. It was an ancient art, and someone like Maier would have associated it with the greatest antiquity. So in a way, it was appropriate, in other words, that alchemy would mingle with classical myth in Atalanta fugiens. Maier and his contemporaries associated alchemy's origins with Hermes Trismegistus, who was a syncretic combination of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, who was thought, when Maier was alive, to have been a contemporary of Moses and the founder of alchemy. We know now that alchemy was not quite that old. Its origins lie rather more in the 1st or the 2nd century in Roman Egypt, where 3 different currents came together to create alchemy as a distinct kind of field, if you will. The world of artisans, particularly people who worked in the luxury trade with expensive products like gemstones, precious metals, and purple dye. This added to Greek natural philosophy, particularly Aristotelian natural philosophy about the origins of metals and the nature of matter. And then the third kind of ingredient, as I always think of it, was the syncretic religious culture of Roman Egypt in the early Christian era. This is the kind of world of Gnosticism and Egyptian mystery cults and Greek and Roman gods kind of all mixed together. So this environment, these 3 facets of alchemy, as a craft, as a science, and as a form of revelatory wisdom, always remained central to alchemy, and they still are central to alchemy today. Although at different moments, one of those elements might kind of rise to the fore, some of them might recede a bit over time. By the time Maier was writing about Atalanta fugiens, he had access to a centuries-long textual tradition that included lots of different ways of writing about alchemy, very practical recipes, how to make stuff, philosophical treatises on alchemical theory, and also more allegorical texts linking, for example, the Philosopher's Stone to Christ. There were literary texts as well. Some of you might know the Canterbury Tales. Alchemists appear in the, I think, final circle of hell in Dante's Inferno. So alchemy by Maier's day was sort of appearing in visual and literary and more kind of non-alchemical kinds of texts as well. The alchemical corpus included Greek texts from Roman Egypt and Byzantium, Arabic texts from the medieval Islamic world, and Latin texts from medieval Christian world, as well as more modern, in Maier's terms, texts in Latin and in the vernacular European languages written around the time of Maier's own life, many of which were circulating in print and manuscript. So for Maier and his contemporaries, alchemy was in part about reading this corpus of books. And one way for Maier's readers, or Maier himself, to approach alchemy was to start reading. Read the alchemical corpus, try to understand some of the most basic principles of the art, for example, the sulfur-mercury-salt theory of metals, and so on. Maier's book, of course, was meant to be a contribution to this canon, but he also integrates many of the older alchemical books quite nicely into his own book. And in fact, the Atalanta fugiens is full of citations and quotes. It includes a huge number of references to other alchemical texts from the ancient, medieval, and early modern alchemical canon. And I'll give you an example here from the first 2 emblems, which together are a quote from Hermes Trismegistus's emerald tablet, Tabula Smaragdina, which was known to Maier's generation as the oldest and most enigmatic alchemical text. The wind carried it in its belly, and the earth is its nurse. So even from the outset, he's already situating you in this world of other texts that extend far beyond Atalanta fugiens. Alchemy, though, was never just a bookish practice. It was always about making things, too, often precious metals, but also medicines, synthetic gemstones, dyes, and other kinds of precious materials. The most well-known desideratum for alchemists, of course, is the Philosopher's Stone, this thing that, if you could successfully make it, could not only transmute base metals into gold, but also make other kinds of alchemical medicines or elixirs that can confer health and longevity. Now, needless to say, the Philosopher's Stone was kind of the ultimate thing that you could create. And there was a good body of theoretical literature, not to mention examples, historical examples of successful transmutations to convince people that this goal was actually quite reachable. And so many wealthy patrons in Maier's day set up laboratories, either where they themselves experimented with various methods of making the Philosopher's Stone, or where they hired other alchemists to do that work for them. So supported by many of the wealthy princes and patrons of Europe, alchemists were often hired to make luxury items, including the Philosopher's Stone, as well as the elixirs and transmutations it could in turn carry out. But alchemists were also hired for their expertise in mining, in metals, more generally, to consult in princely mining enterprises as well. And so we can find them advising princes on how to make their mines more productive in a very kind of prosaic, kind of way. They could advise on new assaying techniques to determine the quantity of precious metals in ore, or new ways to smelt ore to kind of get more out of it. So they were involved in a range of kind of things. And so this practical side, the laboratory side of alchemy, was just as important. Alchemists didn't want to just read books. They wanted to use what they read in order to refine their practices in the laboratory. And then, too, they wanted to write about what they did in the laboratory, moving practice back into text again. And so there's this sort of back and forth between reading, writing, and doing in early modern alchemy. So let's return to this emblem with all of this in mind and look at it once again. The first part of this motto, again, make Latona white, it turns out refers to an actual laboratory practice, the second or white stage in the production of the Philosopher's Stone. Latona here is another pun, a play here on laton or Latin, L-A-T-T-E-N, which is a yellow alloy of zinc and copper, which basically resembles brass, which Maier is instructing the alchemist to further purify. In this emblem, Maier personifies Latin as the Greek goddess Latona, the mother of Apollo and Diana, of Apollo and Diana by Jupiter, but because alchemists associated each metal with a particular planet, Apollo and Diana's associations with the sun and the moon can easily be mapped onto the metals gold and silver as well. The sun was gold, was Apollo, moon, Diana, silver. And so this represents the whitening stage of the Philosopher's Stone, which follows the black phase, which is the sort of putrefying phase, which is referenced here with the flecks of black that need to be cleaned off of Latona in order to go forward. The second part of the motto tells us to rip up the books. In the discourse following this motto, Maier quotes an injunction that appears in a lot of other alchemical texts that books should be ripped up so that your hearts will not be torn. In other words, reading bad books can only cause heartache. He explains that the aspiring alchemist should get rid of confusing or misleading books, which will just only cause anguish, and only read the good, clear, sort of proper books. So I think this emblem gives a really nice sense of what Maier might have been up to in crafting Atalanta fugiens. First of all, Atalanta fugiens is a reader's guide in a way. It's a kind of guide to the vast corpus of text that would have been available to Maier's contemporaries, both in print and in manuscript. By quoting and citing, sometimes explicitly, sometimes a little bit more subtly, you kind of have to dig to find these things, Maier is showing his already learned readers not only what to read, but how to read these books. And I want to point out as well that it's not just the text that quotes in this way, the music quotes as well. I mentioned that Maier took the cantus firmus, the apple's melody, from a well-known part of the Gregorian chant to the Mass. But it turns out that he also lifted almost all of the other fugues as well. One of our collaborators, the musicologist Lauren Ludwig, who's also a performer, discovered recently that Maier took 40 of the 50 fugues from this 1591 English book of ways, as they're called, collected by John Farmer, Divers Sundry Ways of Two Parts. The other 10 fugues might have been written by Maier. They might have been lifted from somewhere else. We're calling them the ones by not Maier at the moment, and by not Farmer, sorry, so we don't know who wrote them. Farmer's Divers Sundry Ways was a book of two-part canons over a cantus firmus. And it was a system for practicing polyphonic composition. So ways here comes from a variety of ways that a compositional idea could be executed musically. Maier tinkered a little bit with Farmer's canons. You know, he transposed the pitch up a quarter, 1/4, but you know, he tinkered with them a little bit, rearranged things a little bit, but basically he lifted the melodies. And in fact, Maier wasn't trying to hide this necessarily. He might be offering a little hint at the connection with Farmer's ways in this emblem, which pictures a farmer. This farmer, the motto tells us, is sowing seeds of gold in white foliated earth. But I think you could also look at the seeds he's sowing as musical notes, and the lines in the ground begin to look a bit like musical stave, right? And he's tossing the musical notes on the ground there. So one way to read Atalanta fugiens then is as a reader's guide into this broader world of music, of alchemical text, of classical myth, and so on. But on the other hand, he's telling us to rip up the books, especially the confusing books. And so we could just read this as an injunction to get rid of the bad books, but he might also have been telling us to get out of the library and into the laboratory. In other words, alchemy cannot remain simply a bookish art. It requires practice as well. And it turns out that some of the emblems in the book do in fact also translate into real chemical processes that you can still do today. So let me just quickly show you this one, emblem 11, which tells us, "Lock the tree with the old man in a bedewed house, and by eating its fruit, he will become young." And the epigram, which you can't see there, says, "In wisdom's garden grows an apple tree with fruits of gold. Take it and our old man, enclose them in a glass house, wet with dew, and let them stay there for many days conjoined. When he's eaten his fill of fruit, behold, the former old man is a youth again." And this is a reference to a well-known alchemical substance, the tree of Diana, and can in fact be read as a description of a chemical process, whereby, to translate into modern chemical terms, a crystalline dendritic growth emerges from a kind of little globule amalgam of silver and mercury in a solution of silver and mercury dissolved in nitric acid. There are multiple trees in alchemical literature. I don't have a picture of a tree of Diana, but I have an even better one of a philosophical tree, the Philosophers tree made out of mercury and gold that my colleague Lawrence Principe, who's a historian of alchemy and a chemist at Johns Hopkins, created in his living room, which sounds bad to me with mercury. But anyway, so this is just to say that a number of these different processes can actually be created. They're describing processes that we still would think of as working. Of course, Maier is hardly advocating rejecting books altogether, right in the middle of his own very elaborate, expensive books that he does want people to read. And he makes this clear in the following discourse by explaining the point is to find a balance between theory and practice, or reading and doing. The last thing that I want to suggest here is that Maier might be hinting that Atalanta fugiens need not be read in a linear order, cover to cover. And in fact, despite the premise of the frontispiece here, that this is a story, a narrative about a race that has an end point, and the insistence on sequence throughout the book, the emblems numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, the book actually doesn't really make sense if you try to read it in a linear sort of way. It does not follow a linear path. It doesn't really tell the story of Atalanta and Hippomenes, it turns out, and it doesn't map that story neatly in the way we might want it to onto a series of steps in making the Philosopher's Stone. And yet there are clusters, there are some combinations embedded in the book that seem to be telling us something. And in fact, in working with this book, it really doesn't take long to want to follow Maier and rip up the book and pull out the sequences. And kind of, they don't appear to be in order. They're scattered throughout the book, but when put together seem to be significant. We cannot, of course, do this to our beautiful copy in the Hay, but we can do this with digital tools. We could look at 2 alchemical hermaphrodites, which represent the union of sulfur and mercury. There are only 2 of them in this book, but we could pull those out. We could look at the birds and see birds often represent the volatile principle in matter. We could look, I sort of like this one. I don't know, I'm calling them everyday men and women. We have a potter, a pregnant woman, the farmer, the woman doing laundry. we could look at the kings. And this sequence I'm particularly interested in. The one on the left, you have a wolf devouring the king, represents a process using antimony to purify gold in the fire. The second king, who's sort of taking a sauna, and the epigram references a classical story about a king, but that's a representation of a vapor bath and using steam to purify matter once again. That king is swimming in mercury. And various other things happen to him, but ultimately he dies when his court physicians in the middle give him a lot of medicine, and he drinks of this medicine, and he dies, but he is reborn in the end. You can see him getting out of the coffin, stronger and more pure. So I think there may be something going on with this king sequence, which is sort of scattered throughout the book. For the music people, there's a lot of really weird things going on in the music. I just pulled out 3 with upside down. You can see it here and in the top and the other 2. You might want to pull out some of the fugues together and see what's going on with those fugues as well. So as I think you can see by now, this is an incredibly complicated book that is operating on many different levels at once. Maier is aiming to intervene in debates about alchemical theory, to communicate the right texts to read and the correct way, in his view, to make the Philosopher's Stone. And most of all, Maier is using this to make a really ambitious claim for alchemy, and that is that it's erudite, that it's courtly, that it's learned, it's entertaining, and it's fit to be discussed at the princely courts of Europe, where, not incidentally, he was trying to get a job. He is trying to distance alchemy, not from the laboratory, but from the kind of dirty workshop of artisans, where the artisans are just sort of tinkering around with alchemy in their own workshops. And he's making the claim that alchemy requires practice, but also deep, deep scholarly and technical expertise. Atalanta fugiens raises a number of bigger issues, too, about the relationship between print and secrecy. If you want to explain how to make the Philosopher's Stone, why would you encode it in a book like this rather than just print a recipe? It raises questions about Renaissance cryptography and games, debates about epistemology and the senses, the role of the mind, the ears, and the eyes in gathering knowledge, about print as an instrument for producing knowledge, and the status of alchemy in a period in which it was deeply contested, as it was in 17th century Europe. So on one level, Project Atalanta is about generating new scholarship about a book, Atalanta fugiens, that is well known but really little understood by scholars working in this period. The collaborative nature of this project is really crucial to its success. And in bringing together many different sorts of expertise into conversation around Atalanta fugiens, we're hoping to recapture the early modern map of learning that had not yet fractured into disciplines. In short, what a single reader in Maier's day would be able to grasp, alchemical theory, Greek mythology, emblem culture, and music, and so on, we now need a huge team of people in order to understand. We need to collaborate to understand this. And previous efforts to understand Atalanta fugiens have been hampered, really, by the limits of modern disciplinary horizons. So we think that by bringing together this interdisciplinary group, together, we can understand this important early modern book in new sorts of ways. But we're also creating a digital edition of this book because we believe that a digital form will allow readers to recapture the early modern interactive and multimedia experience of hearing, seeing, reading, and manipulating the book. The multimedia features of this text, and particularly the music, for example, are difficult for most modern readers to grasp without a bit of help. We need modern annotations to explain it. We need recordings, most of us, to be able to hear that music. And so we do plan to create recordings working with Les Canards Chantantes, working with our singing ducks, so that users of this edition will be able to hear the music as it sounded. We also hope to annotate the emblems to orient readers towards the most basic alchemical terms and perhaps link out to some of the text that Maier is referencing so that you could sort of go back and forth. And ultimately, we think that this project will make it possible for readers, by which I mean other scholars, but also students, all of you, hopefully, and even contemporary practicing alchemists, of which there are many who still use this book. we hope that our digital edition and the scholarship surrounding it will make it possible for people to kind of annotate, manipulate, and experience this book with their eyes, ears, and mind, just as Maier intended his 17th century readers to do. So I will stop there. There's a little time for questions. I'm happy to take questions, but thank you all for coming today and for entering into this world with me. Yes?
Well, I have a question about the aspect of censorship in the text. That seems worrisome, and I'm wondering who is going to make these decisions and how far it was going and how common it was at the time and so forth.
What do you mean about censorship in this particular text?
Well, the destruction of books is a form of censorship.
Oh, this destruction of books. Yeah, I don't think that's exactly what Maier intends. I mean, he is certainly asserting himself as an expert and saying these books are good, these books are useless, right? And this is a period in which the number of printed alchemical books had really grown. And there were some ones that, publishers saw a good market in printing alchemical books. And so they printed some that someone like Maier thought were not particularly learned. They didn't really know what they were talking about. So I think he's instructing people to get rid of the bad books. He wants them to keep this book. And I don't know that he would say they should be censored in the sense of, the index of prohibited books, for example. But he is certainly positioning himself as an expert. And particularly with respect to patrons, as someone who could help a patron kind of wade his or her way through all the different people who are claiming to be authoritative alchemists in this period. He's saying, I know the good books and the bad books, and I can guide you through this. Right?
So it was he that was going to make the decisions. He wasn't recommending others do that.
Right, and in fact, princes often did hire alchemists as kind of managers of their laboratories to hire others because princes got all kinds of letters from people saying, I can make this medicine, I got this powder that I bought from a mysterious man who then disappeared, and I think it might be the Philosopher's Stone. And princes didn't necessarily, although some of them did, but didn't necessarily have the expertise to kind of differentiate among all these different claims. So they sometimes did hire alchemists to kind of sort through that so that they didn't invest their own money in fraudulent alchemists. There was a real concern about fraud in this period, and so he's kind of proposing that he can solve this problem. Yes?
How will you make the bridge to the real chemical technology of the time? Will you have images of labs and lab equipment? Will you show material transformations? Will you really introduce people to the marvels that were being described so they can visualize, like the mercury tree?
Yeah, we're hoping, again, we're very fortunate to have, this is kind of the new hot thing for historians of alchemy, is to do replications of alchemical processes. And so we have a number of colleagues doing that. And particularly the guy, Larry Principe, who made that Philosopher's Tree, we're hoping we can create some videos of him creating these things. I think it's really important for people to understand that this isn't just, Carl Jung, for example, wrote about that tree and said, well, it represents, the psyche's development, and it's not really about matter. And so Principe said, actually, watch this, and made it. So we hope to be able to capture some of that. And there's also some good archaeology of early modern alchemical laboratories. So we do have good examples of the laboratory equipment and instruments, so we can show that as well. Yes?
Excuse me. Chinese alchemy seemed to have a different focus than Western alchemy. Mm-hmm. Is there any cross-pollination? Is there much, under the cover, European interest and vigor for old men?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And when I teach history of alchemy, my students do spend some time on the Chinese material, the Chinese traditions of Neidan and Waidan as well. Those terms being translated into alchemy suggests that they are part of the same tradition, right? And some have argued that there was some sort of cross-pollination. And there are remarkable similarities, an interest in gold and longevity, vigor. But it's a question of, are these coincidences, or I don't think that there's much direct connection. certainly for someone like Maier, he would not have known, I think, as far as I know, he would not know anything about the Chinese traditions.
So many years ago, I was taught that the real focus of alchemy was turning base metals into gold.
Right.
And
In Western alchemy.
in Western alchemy.
Yeah, that was a key piece of it. So the Philosopher's Stone was one very important piece of it, and almost sort of the signature goal of alchemy, but not the only goal. So, Maier is certainly engaging with that and proposing one way to do it, but there's a lot of other stuff going on. Whether or not you make the Philosopher's Stone, this is a really fun game to play, to try to decode this book.
And another question. One of my pet peeves about using digital material is response time. So, and years ago, IBM had studies that showed that variable response time really cut down productivity and understanding. So, are you imagining that you'll have a single package that people might download or purchase so that everything is going to be on their probably tablet or phone at once, or are you expecting that they're going to have to keep going back and forth to the web?
We're envisioning, well, this is where we're really fortunate to be working with the Mellon Digital Publishing Initiative here, and a digital editor and a graphic designer, and so I'm assuming that some of those things will be addressed, but we're envisioning it as a web format right now, and have different ways that people can engage with it. I would love to have sort of a workspace where if I, for example, teach a class around this book, my students could, I could have one class worth of students all working on this book and working on different emblems and creating all these annotations that would just be for that class that not everyone else needs to see, right? That sort of thing. But then some of these things will, of course, be permanent and visible to everyone. So this is where we're just getting started on the actual designing of the thing. We have visions right now. We have very big aspirations, and we'll check back in a year, and by then I think we'll have a prototype that people can look at.
Surely text, consider response time.
Okay, response time, duly noted. Okay.
Do you have any idea why he printed some of the music upside down? I mean, first thing is he's changing high notes to low notes, or reversing the sequence, or...
Yeah, sometimes, like there's one of the emblems that makes reference to the planetary movement, and they look like they go forwards and then backwards, and the music actually goes forwards and backwards in that case. So that's an example of where the music sort of mirrors the text, and in fact when our singing ducks sing that one, they walk back and forth when they, that particular, the upside down, I'm not sure that they have figured that out yet. I'm not the musicologist to figure that out. There are also questions about how you actually sing from this book. It's not very big. And there are 3 of them sort of huddled around this. The first time I saw them do this, they knocked heads with each other. So, there's some advantage to having someone on the other side singing upside down, but I don't think that's actually what it is. But there's so many puzzles in the music. There's a long list of errata at the end of the book as well, that my colleague Donna Billack thinks might be a kind of code as well. So we'll see. Yes?
You may have mentioned this, but is there any credit to the artist who did the woodblock?
Yeah, so we think that they're done by Matthias Marian under the direction of Michael Maier himself. So a well-known engraver from the period working at the DeBry publishing firm. So yeah, and who did engravings. That publishing house engraved a number of other alchemical, hermetic, philosophical books in this period. So this was really the engravers you wanted to do this kind of book.
2 questions. First of all, how is this unique? I mean, and I'm thinking of the multimedia aspects of it. Were many books around the same time, as complicated basically as this is? And then my next question, do you know what kind of impact it had at the time? What readers did with it? Did it have an influence on alchemy?
Yeah, so there are other emblem books with music, but this is a pretty extraordinary example. This is, again, Evie Lincoln in art history here says, this is just like throwing every possible thing into this book and making it as elaborate as possible. It's really a virtuoso performance of not just print technology, but his own erudition and there was a strong interest in alchemical circles in creating concordances in this period between, Greek natural philosophy and Hebrew prophecy, and so in a way, he's doing that as well with the music. In terms of the reception, this was intended to be kind of his calling card to get a job. The book, there are many copies of it that still exist. You can imagine collectors like this book. Alchemists today love this book because you could play around with it forever and come up with different interpretations. But this is one of the things we don't know very much about. That's one of the pieces of this project I'm especially interested in this, is the afterlife of the book. There is a later edition that takes out the music. An 18th century edition. So there are other editions that sort of just get rid of one of the pieces. It's hard to print music, so you can imagine, the pictures are pretty, the alchemy's nice, forget the music part of it. So to follow the kind of print history of the book and to imagine our own digital edition as some kind of, participating in that, I think I'm very curious to see that long history of the book. Yes?
Are there any facsimile versions that have been translated into English?
Yeah, so there are a couple. This is the same problem. There's a scholar at Colgate called Jocelyn Godwin he has the music and the translation of the text, but no images. And he's a music scholar, so he's interested in the music. So that's one piece missing. There's a edition from the 60s by Helena de Jong, which translates. So hers is a study of the references out to other texts. It was her dissertation, it was in Dutch. She translated everything into Dutch, and that has now been translated into English. So you can read that one, and you can read through all of the emblems, but the translations are a bit problematic because it's Latin, Dutch, English. And the images are all at the back. It's not a facsimile. They're stuck in the back. So all the pieces are there, but you have to put them together. And to us, it's absolutely crucial to retain, even though you can't see it there, to retain this kind of layout. And so we will have a high resolution copy of the entire book so that those who want to can look at it like this. And then our vision at the moment anyway is to also have a transcribed version that people can pull out different pieces and sort of move around the pieces. So one version you can rip up, and the other one that reminds you that this is actually, there's a certain rhythm to the book as Maier intended it, and I think these existing modern editions, so much is lost by just leaving out one part of it, right? And that's that disciplinary divide thing that, I'm a historian of alchemy, so I'm good with the alchemy part. The music, I can't, so I always am neglecting the music a little bit, and musicologists kind of maybe don't know what to do with the alchemy part, so it's easy to leave out one part of it. Yes?
Has anyone looked at this as basically a theory of everything? So it's a theory of mind, it's macrocosm, microcosm, so the physical world, spiritual world.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's sort of what Maier's up to. And so actually this first emblem on the left, the following discourse, he says, if you want to read this chemically, here's what it means. If you read it musically, it represents a fifth. If you read it astronomically, it represents the middle point of these 3 planets. If you read it arithmetically, it's a point. If you read it, and I think it's kind of ridiculous, but I think what he's saying is, it is everything. You can read this 7 different ways. You can read this book that follows in all of these different ways, and it is microcosm, macrocosm, everything is linked, everything represents something else, which is where you can get really lost in this book,
Yeah.
but what's fun with it, too? I think there's one more.
Is it clear from the technology of book publishing in the early 17th century that the way we have the book now bound is the way it was always bound?
Right. So it wouldn't have looked like this with this binding, and often books were sold unbound, and individuals could bind them or combine them with other things. So one of the pieces of this project, too, this is, again, we're at the pie in the sky stage, is I would like this digital edition to have a way to link back to individual copies of this book that exist in various libraries. So there's a copy at Columbia, for example, that someone has bound in a number of blank pages and then written a little mini treatise. A historical person, I can't remember, maybe from the 17th century, but has sort of bound in their own notes with the book, right? And every individual copy there are some, back to the censorship question, there's another copy that has some of there's a kind of a lewd story that follows between Sol and Luna. They have an incestuous relationship, and there's a lot of, sexy bits in the book, and one of the copies is scribbled out, kind of. So I really would love for libraries that own individual copies to have a way to attach information about their copies to our kind of universal generic digital edition, so that if someone really gets into Emblem 2, they could go see what other, and that gets to the reader's response as well, and see if there's marginalia or,
The imagery is mostly figure ground.
Sorry?
Figure ground.
Uh-huh.
Is there imagery that transforms, like alchemy does, figure ground into abstraction?
So I'm not sure I'm an expert enough in art to fully understand your question, but I've shown you most of these images that have a person standing in a landscape, right? And I should just, as a sort of an aside, I'm super interested in the landscape and whether there's a way to connect up the landscape. It sounds like you might know Vesalius's anatomical images of the man being dissected. It's a series of images, but they actually, if you line them up, the landscape lines up. So he's sort of walking through the landscape. There's a lot of stuff happening in the landscape here that I wonder if you could put them together. There are some more abstract images with sort of perspective grid lines, for example. Some of them are much more flat. Some of them don't have landscape at all. So I didn't show those today, but there's kind of a variety of different types of images, although most of them look sort of like this, some kind of strange figure standing inside or outside. I don't know if that gets to your question. Kind of does. Okay. Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned that a lot of libraries have copies of this, which is sort of indicative frequently of the importance of the book over the years. It could also be indicative of a fairly large number that were published. Do you know anything about those?
Yeah, so I actually don't know the print run. It's a little bit confusing because there's a 1617 edition and a 18 edition, and they're a bit kind of confused. In terms of how people have appreciated this book, the music has actually, most musicologists have said, this is really kind of crummy music. It's old-fashioned music. It's very medieval. This isn't, a good example of Renaissance beautiful music. Historians of alchemy have always really liked it because it's kind of fun to play around with. Alchemists themselves like it, especially more modern alchemists who tend to emphasize alchemy as a very esoteric kind of undertaking that's about puzzles and hidden secrets and hidden games. This is kind of an unusual book for the 17th century in that respect, but it resonates very nicely with particularly 19th century alchemists. So the music has been kind of, people don't think it's that interesting. The images are good, So again, that's part of that reception question that we just don't know very much about it yet.
How many copies are in libraries today that you are aware of?
I think my colleague Donna Billick has been traveling around visiting them, and I think she said she has visited some 30-something. So, it's a book that people saved. Neil, books?
I think the audience question, even in the early modern period, is really fascinating because it's still, even as I was listening to your presentation, I was trying to think, who would have been looking at this? Who would have been excited to see it? Who would have gone out of their way? What kind of access did other people have to it? So I think it's a really interesting question, which you've alluded to. Mm-hmm. I wonder also how much thought you guys have put into the audience for this digital platform, because it also seems to me, as you were talking about the layers of complexity of a text like this, and the amount of erudition necessary for somebody to understand it in the period as well as today, obviously that, the digital form, the digital model can be an access point to some ways of connecting to that, but it can also be something either much more simple or much more complex. And I just wonder what you guys are thinking in that. along those lines?
This is something we have discussed a lot this semester. So there's a certain basic level of information that most people today need to get into this book at all, right? Starting with translation. So it's not in English, and so for English speakers, that's a problem. And so we hope to provide kind of a minimum to allow people to get into the book themselves. One of the challenges, and we've talked a bit about this, but is how to give users, readers, enough information to understand it, but not try to say, this is how it works. This is what this book means. I don't think, one of the people with this project made the point that there's a difference between a puzzle and a game. A puzzle is something that's meant to be solved, and then you're done. And you can take it apart and do it again, but you're done. Whereas a game is something that's meant to be played continually and in different ways each time. I think this is a game, not a puzzle. And I don't think that there's one way to understand this. And so that, too, is what makes this appealing as a digital edition, I think. We want to put enough information in people's hands so that they can begin to engage the book the way I think Maier's readers would have, and possibly also in ways Maier's readers never would have. So I myself am very open to the idea of people doing things with this book that an early modern person would not have done. We need to sort of find a way to communicate that you're now, doing something Maier couldn't have envisioned. But, so finding that right balance between giving people enough information but not kind of closing down their own way of playing with the book is a real question. I'm thinking about maybe next fall teaching a class around this book and sort of trying a lot of this out with my students. I think of them as a really good test audience. And get into the library, look at the old book, but also give them some digital way of playing around with it to kind of make them into a focus group, see what they do. And I think that would be incredibly informative. Yeah.
I think one of the other things that we've seen in libraries is when items are made available online, regardless of how esoteric they are, more people are interested in accessing them because they're actually able to. Whether they consciously do it or by accident kind of fall into it. So I think that this will be quite a unique experience in addition to the scholarly aspect, but I think experientially it will be fascinating to people.
I hope so.
I'm intrigued by your saying that books were sometimes sold in unbound form, and I wondered if that was true of this book, and if they're usually, if they are unbound, are they paginated so that you have sort of the
right order?
Through? Because I was kind of curious whether, since he plays with so many ideas, that the idea of ripping up the book might be an allusion to putting things in a different form.
So that's one of the things that's really funny about this. So I don't know if this was sold unbound or not, but it's quite possible. He's so insistent on order, right? All these fugues and emblems have number, and he does this, which is totally unnecessary. He puts a catchword here. That's the first word on the following page, but it's the back of the same page. Obviously, that's the next page, right? You don't need that on this one. You need it on this one to take you up to that, so you know that's the next page. But this is totally unnecessary. So it's almost so excessive that it's suspicious. You can kind of become a little crazy working on this book and start to think everything's significant, But he's got, all of this, like the C and the B3, and all of this is about assembling the pages in the proper order. And yet, I don't know. And I think it was meant to be in that order, but I think he's inviting other ways of thinking about it. My colleague Donna Billack has another theory so this is 50 emblems. She thinks that these two emblems, 1 and 2, because they're two parts of the same sentence from the Emerald Tablet, are meant to be combined, which then gives you 49 emblems. And she thinks it's a 7x7 magic square, which if you reorganize the numbers of the emblems so that it's a magic square, it is the magic square of Venus. And so her theory at the moment is that he's also inviting people to imagine reorganizing everything, and then you can look at different juxtapositions, because different emblems are near each other, or opposite each other, front and back, or, and so she thinks that that's one way he might have intended it. I think a looser way is to say, you know, go find all the kings, go find all the dragons. There are dragons and salamanders and the lions, and, you know, that's a sort of simpler way to do it. Or assemble this process of working with mercury. You could pull that out, you know. So we don't know, but yeah, okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming today. I really appreciate it. Enjoy your weekend here.